Good morning, everybody. This week's Parsha is Parsha Miketz. I want to actually share the assignment, which is hopefully going to be extremely cool, and you're going to walk out of here being totally ahad, but I can't take any credit for it whatsoever. But it's extremely, extremely insightful. And I think the fundamental question is, does God really speak to man? Does God speak to man today? By man, I mean like human beings. Is there some type of divine communication? We know that the Mishnah in Sota says that there's no longer any nevuah, that we no longer have prophets, but perhaps there's still some type of messages that God gives us even in our world, and they're just hidden. Which, by the way, I often give the shiur on chanuka, because it's Parshas Miketz, so there's no question this is the message of Hanukkah. Hanukkah is after the Tanakh is canonized, it's post-biblical. Yet nonetheless, Chazal saw events of Hanukkah as a message from the Rebbeinu Shalom. So you got to see various messages. This will be next week's topic, by the way. We'll talk about Hanukkah next Monday. I apologize to Parshas Vayigash in advance. But I think one of the things you have to understand is, how does God kind of speak to human beings? And we're going to see a key, something very clever in this week's Parsha. And what also is pretty neat is that we see there's direct divine communication with Avraham Baruch Hu, Yitzchak Baruch Hu, and Yaakov. And then what? It just stops. Who's the next person that the Chumash records who speaks to God directly after Yaakov? Moshe. Understand what happened to Bnei Yisrael and their children and their children. So for 4 generations, there's Gornished. Now you're going to tell me, they lived in Chutzars. Okay. But where does Moshe live? You want to tell me that there's communication to Moshe Rabbeinu because it's the Mevaser of the Geula, the Kuzari, said there's no Nevuah in Chutzars, and when there is, it's only because Yechezkel is describing perhaps all to redemption. Moshe would be another example. Okay, so since the Bnei Yisrael weren't even close to Geula, it was the beginning of the Galus, so therefore there's no reason to communicate, maybe. But you can't tell me that there's an off and on switch. It makes a lot more sense to say there are things that are just maybe a little bit more hidden, not as direct. What I want to show you, that I think there's a very cool message in this week's Parsha, but it's totally hidden, and you got to really dig a little bit deep to figure it out, and that's what we're going to do right now. And do you know what it comes down to? It comes to a very fundamental question. Yosef is going to be hauled in front of Paro, hear the chalomos of Paro, and right away give an interpretation. How do you know that? Like, how did Yosef have the guts to say, this is what the dream means? There is nothing rational about the dream that you'd interpret. Let's use the cow. We all know the dream, right? So what do you have? You got 7 fat cows, you got 7 skinny cows. And the 7 fat cows, what do? Devour the 7? No.
Or is it the other way? The skinny ones eat the fat ones.
No, the fat ones are first.
Right.
And then you have the skinny cows. And the skinny cows devour the fat cows. And what happens to the skinny cows? They remain skinny. Right? So, how in the world did he know, meaning Yosef, that cows represent what? 7 cows represent 7 years. How in the world did he know that? And that's totally counterintuitive. The Midrash says, what did all the Khartoumim think they meant? Cows meant what? Daughters. You ever heard this before? You have 7 daughters and they'll die. Right? You never heard that before? Other things that Chazal say, cities, 7 cities be devoured. I'll tell you what's also counterintuitive. Because cows are things, and yours are not things. If you take a look at all the other dreams that we have in Sefer Bereshis, they're all logical. Let's go back to last week's Parsha. Let's go through the Sarah Ophim, Sarah Mashkim. 3, right? In the dream itself, he is serving Paro. Well, it makes sense. If he's having a dream he's going to serve Paro, it makes sense. He will one day serve Paro. Not so crazy. But here we have something which is concrete, cows, is really something abstract, years. How did Yosef know that? How do you know that? And we don't see anyone in Chumash. Vayavo Agadash Baruch Hu Balayla LeYosef Vayomer Lo Hinei Achalom. We don't see that. We don't see any type of message, nevuah, that God gives Yosef, giving him dream understanding abilities. So therefore it has to be based on intuition. It's intuitive. Now some people are just more intuitive than others. How did Yosef become so intuitive? And how come he was able to get it on the drop of the dime? I'm going to show you that there's a message. You guys are also going to figure it out. But you know what? Only Yosef can figure it out. You know why? Because there's actually a description of Yosef's life. And if you read the Chumash, it's describing Yosef. So when Yosef hears the dream, he says, oh my goodness, I'm giving you the answer to help you. It's describing me and my life. Therefore, I know the answer, what everything means. But anyone else who'd hear it would think it's just mumbo jumbo. Are you ready for this? This is totally blow away. You're going to walk out of this room different than you walked in. And if not, you get your money back. Which is fine, because I can say that because no one's paying anything, which is good too. Okay, it's not good, but alright, let's go on. Take a look at this. Okay, so Yosef goes through an experience only Yosef experiences. So Yosef has a shared experience. He has a secret. Watch this. You have in front of you, in source 1, I made this into a column, where you have Yosef's life the way it was on the right-hand side. That's last week's Parsha. And you have this week's Parsha in that second column. Here we go. Let's just look at, for our sake, that first column, that second column. So I'm going to read Perek Aleph, and you're going to tell me, where do you see things in Yosef's life already that this happened to? Take a look at this. Vayishlach Paro. Paro calls Vayikra El Yosef. Now, who else summons and calls Yosef in last week's Parsha? I'm going to help you with this one. It's Yaakov. Right, Yaakov is Yosef's father figure, and you'll see to some extent Paro is also going to be Yosef's father figure. I'll prove that in a minute. Now, Vayikra Yosef, Varitzuhu min habor. He takes him out of the bore. Ladies, is Yosef in a bore? Where is Yosef? He's in jail. The Torah doesn't say jail. The Torah calls it a bore. But that's really neat, because he was in a bore, wasn't he? So here's what's happening. There's a reversal of Yosef's life. Now, how did Yosef was kind of put in the bore by his father, to some extent. No, because his father calls him, says, go check out your brothers, and that's when he finds himself in the pit, right? What?
I don't know.
Oh, sorry, pit. So, with that, his father, you'll see why Paro is a father figure in a minute, is now calling him and removing him from the bore, from the pit. That it shouldn't be called the pit. It should have been called jail. When the Torah uses the word pit, it wants us to go back in history to the time that his father sent him to a pit. And now he's taking him out. And now we're going to rewind Yosef's life by reading this narrative. Look at this. Vayomer Pro Yosef, Chalom chalamti, ufoter enoso. Who else tells her about a dream? Well, Yosef also tells his dad about a dream, right? So Paro now is telling Yosef about a dream, right? Okay, but his father also turns to Yosef and says, I know that you had a dream. Ufoter enoso, v'ni shamati lecha lemor, tishma chalom liftor oso. Give an interpretation of the dream. Please give me interpretation of the dream. Well, that's pretty neat, because it's the exact conversation that Yaakov has with Yosef. Vayan Yosef al Paro lemor, biladai Elokim ya'aneh es shalom Paro. Now, it's also a little bit interesting, by the way. By the way, I'm going to prove to you actually right now to make your life a little bit easier. You know, I know that Paro's like a father figure. Your father provides you with clothing and gives you a name, no? What does Paro provide Yosef? A new name and clothing. It gives him food, shelter, clothing. That's exactly what the father does. That's what Paro is doing. And by the way, the last thing that happens to Yosef before he goes into a pit, he gets stripped of his clothing. So the father figure, here's the new dad, called Paro, giving him the very thing that he was stripped of. By the way, what does his biological father really give him? Special clothing. And now this Paro gives him special clothing. And this Paro will give him a name, and this Paro is going to give him a wife, and this Paro is going to give him everything. To some extent, Paro is his second father. So again, Paro is coming to Yosef, Chalom Chalamti, give me an interpretation of a dream, which is kind of the opposite, right? No one wants to hear Yosef's dream. Okay. Here we go. Just checking my notes. All right, let's go on. So what's the next thing that happens? Okay, hopefully help. So listen to this dream. Standing by the Yor. Now I have a question for you. You guys have been alive for, more than 20 years. And you've heard, people describe cows in many different ways. You ever heard someone describe a cow as Yefos Toar? You ever seen, some sexist guy see a nice cow and whistle? And say, hey, what a Yefos Toar cow, hey. You don't see that in university too often, where people whistle at good-looking cows, right? It's strange, no? What was that?
Cows can be really ugly.
Yeah, so it's very strange that cows are described as Yefas Toar, no? So, Yefas Toar cows. Now look at the next word. Vatir'ena ba'achu. The word ba'achu sure sounds like grazing with my brothers, doesn't it? Well, that's interesting, because Yosef also grazes with his brothers, doesn't he? Here's something else which is really neat. Who is described as Yefas Toar? Yosef. Who else? As the females who have Yefas, who's beautiful? Rachel, no? These are Rachel cows, grazing with her brother. And look what happens. There's 7 other cows. V'inei sheva paros acheros olos achrehen, dolos raos toar meod virakos. Wow! Who else is described in Chumash as Einei blank rakos? The answer is source 5, Leah. Source 5 tells me that Leah is rakos and Rachel is Yefas Toar v'Yefas Mar'eh. Is it crazy? Again, for me to describe cows as Yefas Toar and rakos, those are super ugly cows. As opposed to other cows which are super beautiful. That's very strange. It's almost as if the Chumash is saying there are 7 Leah cows and 7 Rachel cows. And again, Vatir'ena, they're grazing Ba'chu, from the word Ach, brothers, my brothers. So Yosef is hearing these dreams, is holy jeepers. Here's a guy who pulls me out of a bore, even though it's really a jail, gives me clothing. Okay, we'll see later on how he's going to change his name and give him a wife. That didn't happen yet. And then he hears that cows are being described as his mother and his stepmother. He's like, holy jeepers, no wonder no one's able to figure it out. I'm the only person that can figure it out because this is describing my life. And no one in the world would know all this information. Well, maybe his brothers would. Now, let's go on. Have you ever seen, again, to describe, we've never seen such ugly cows ever in Egypt. I mean, that's a strange way to describe cows. Cows, as Jen said, are usually ugly. A little bit more, a little bit worse. But again, to describe them as beautiful, Yefas Toar, is a very strange way to describe cows. And it's a very extreme to describe cows as rakos basar, that I've never seen so ugly. Vatochalna haparos harakos haraos asheva paros harishonos vabrios. And the 7 skinny cows devour the 7 fat cows. Again, vatochalna. Where do we see in Chumash where 7 Leah people destroy the Rachel. Well, that's kind of what happens. Yosef gets destroyed by the brothers of Leah. It's Yehuda, no? Destroys him. Vatavonu el kerbena v'lo noda kivau el kerbena marehen ra kasher batachila va'ikat v'lo noda. And by the way, it's also true. No one really knows what happened. Yaakov doesn't know what happens. This concept we don't know. We're missing information here. It's a peculiar situation. It's a strange scenario. And again, this seems to be exactly what's going on. And again, if you just look quickly on the right-hand side, I can even show this to you, where you have Pasuk Yud Beis Vayochu Echav Liros, where the brothers go to graze, where Yaakov in Pasuk Yud Gimel sends Yosef Ashlachacha, right? And in Pasuk Chav Gimel again, where the words are bolded, Vayvshitu es Yosef, and again they stripped him of the clothing. I just wanted to show you those words. And Chav Ches, it ends with the Vayalu Yosef Mina Bor, and eventually he gets slipped out of the bor that first time. So I want to show you that, there's these parallels between these two stories. And the heart to me can't figure it out. You know why they can't figure it out? Because unless you're part of Yosef's life, it's kind of pretty hard to understand what is going on. Now, we're not done yet. Because right now, I'd come to a conclusion. It would have been much better if it would have been 6 and 6, right? Because we know there's 6 children of Yaakov, there's 6 children of Leah, and 6 children of Rachel. I realize there's shvachos involved here, right? So it's just a reversal. Is it 2 plus 4? Is it 4 plus 2? But nonetheless, they're still called Leah and Rachel, right? They just have shvachos to them. But we don't have that. It's not 6 and 6. It's 7 and 7. We got to figure out what that is. So it could be Yosef's like, I'm missing something here. So now, okay, and by the way, when the 7 cows of Leah devoured the 7 cows of Rachel, so there's no trace left, right? There's nothing left of them. Kind of the same idea. There's no trace of, it's like the perfect crime, right? Where they didn't do anything wrong, they got rid of him, he's disappeared, there's nothing left. Now, here's a question. How are we going to deal with the whole 7 and 7 thing, right? Because how did Yosef, we still didn't get the fact that how does Yosef know that 7 really means years? So here's something which is very important. How long did Yaakov have to work? Well, take a look at this. We know that Yosef works for extremely long period of time. Take a look, please, at source number 9. V'yahav Yaakov es Rachel v'yomer avdecha sheva shanim berachel b'tzcha ktana. He has to work. Yaakov has to work 7 years for Rachel, and that won't work, will it? He's going to have to work 7 years for, well, he's going to get duped. He has to work another 7 years for Leah, but really it's like, because he got Leah, so he has to work another 7 years to get Rachel. So, it's almost as if, by the way, take a look at the language of the Chumash. How does the Torah describe here we go. Look at Chav Zayin. So again, he works for 7 years, he gets duped, works another 7 years. Look at the end there. Oh, look at Pasuk Chav first. In source 9. But the 7 years are like days, right? They kind of get devoured very quickly. Look at the end in Chav Zayin. Work another 7 years. And again, the 7 years, I should put the next part. So again, for Yaakov, appeared to go by very quickly. It's like they were devoured. It's like there was no trace of them, kind of because of the work that he did. So it appears the following, that Yosef realizes that the 7 years that were shepherding for Rachel, for Rachel, the 7 Rachel years, right? A total of 14 years is almost as if the 7 years were totally devoured. They were totally consumed. The 7 years that he did working hard for Rachel were devoured by the 7 years of Leah. And the 7 years of Leah were devoured by Rachel. So I think that is how Yosef can turn to Paro, and he says that what are these 7 cows? It's all about shepherding for these cows, right? That's where he realizes maybe that 7 cows are 7 years. The 7 years working for Rachel get devoured by the 7 years working for Leah. Now you see, what's very important is that this also has meaning for Paro as well. Good cows are good years. Bad cows are bad years. So you might say to yourself, if you want to be pessimistic, and say that the bad years will be so bad they're going to devour everything, there'll be nothing left. But Yosef says, you don't understand. Why is God giving me this interpretation? It must be, Yosef realizes, that there's something he can do about it. I mean, God wouldn't give him this dream understanding ability just for kicks, just to make it on some like late night TV show. But rather, he's being told this because he must be that with this information, he could do something about it and have an impact. And besides, this is only meaningful to Yosef. No one else could figure this out, that cows means years, except for Yosef. Because he's the only one that realizes, talking about Rachel and Leah, and he's the one that realizes, wait a second, when have you worked so hard, right? I know when was the number 7 ever connected to Rachel and 7 ever connected to Leah? The answer is only when my father worked for both of them. So therefore, it must be, I think, Yosef concludes on his own, and this is what makes Yosef wise and smart. And he says, there's something that I can do about the shared experience. God is talking to me through Paro, trying to tell me something. That is Yosef's tremendous insight, when he realizes all these patterns. So what does he conclude? Now go back for a second. Yosef knows about his dreams. And what are his dreams? They're about bowing to him. And they're about wheat. So Yosef says, wait a second. Wheat. The dreams that I had were food dreams. And it must be that if you gather enough food, the food can bow down to me. Meaning, what does Yosef then suggest? I'll be in charge of the food distribution. And I'll make sure that there'll be enough food for those difficult times. So therefore, he builds silos for storage. Now, remember what I'm going to read this inside. He's going to suggest to Paro that you need the right person for the job. Now, of course, Yosef is thinking, who's the best person for the job? Me. Kind of like the opposite of Haman. Right? Haman also thought he'd be good for the job of right on the king and all that stuff, right? There's a lot of parallels in Yosef and Haman, but not for now. Right? What tribe is Mordechai from? Binyamin? Okay. So, remember that would it be typical, if Paro was having dreams about cows, would that be a typical thing that people in Egypt would dream about? Well, the answer is not really, because we know that cows were considered godly. You didn't really like cows in Egypt. But who were the shepherds? Well, Yaakov's family, Yosef's family, were classic shepherds. So perhaps when he hears that these cows are out there grazing, right? That's what it says. They're grazing by the Yaor. No cows graze by the Yaor. They don't do that in Egypt. So who grazes cows? That's also part of Yaakov's. That's part of Yosef's family. How many dreams does Paro have? Paro has 2 dreams. One about cows and one about wheat. What happens? The same idea. Right? You take a look. Where's the second dream? That's pasuk. Go back, please, in Chav Beis. There are 7 stalks coming out of one sheaf. Milei os v'tavos. Who else dreams about sheaves of wheat? Yosef himself says, I've had these dreams. I've dreamt about wheat. I know what these dreams are about. By the way, Yosef has 2 dreams, and Paro has 2 dreams. And both of them dream about wheat. So Yosef says, I need to look at my own life. Think about my sheaves. What do they mean? And again, the 7. Right? Again, they're described as Mileos V'Tavos, and again, they're being devoured. The 7 ichi ones are devouring the 7 nice ones. So I think Yosef again is saying there's something connected to my life. There's something connected and speaking to me. It's relevant to Paro, it's relevant to Egypt, and it's also relevant to Yosef and Yosef's personal life. Why was I dreaming about wheat? So, what's really neat, by the way, Yosef dreams about stars and Yosef dreams about wheat. Why was I dreaming about wheat? Paro, to some extent, is dreaming about Yosef's life. What is Yosef's life? Being devoured. Being devoured. No? Leaving no trace of Yosef's life. And Yosef's dreams are about whose life? Paro's life. Or, I would say, dreaming about the future of Egypt. I was dreaming Paro's future. What do I mean? Maybe Yosef is saying, who are all these things bowing? They're bowing to Paro. Or maybe to me if I can get this new position, potentially. But, I mean, what I think what Yosef is realizing, that Paro's dreaming about Yosef's life, and Yosef's dreaming about Paro's life. So now Yosef says, have all this wheat that's been gathered, they're bowing down to the middle. That might not be so crazy that who they are bowing down to, they're actually bowing down to Paro. Or you could argue that Yosef is really thinking, I should get this position, it's to me. I'm not sure which way that goes. But regardless, it's the notion of the wheat is coming and bowing to a power. Maybe that is the power of Egypt. And the stars and the moon, right? That's the world of, the ancient world of Paro. Bowing down, everyone's bowing. The sun, moon, stars are bound to Paro. That's how Paro, the great ruler of the world, saw himself, that everyone bows down to him. Now, or you could argue that maybe when I'm in charge of all the wheat, they're all going to bow down to me. Right? When I'm in charge of the wheat, the sun, moon, stars, maybe my own family perhaps, will bow down to me. Or not even my own family, maybe just the whole world will bow down to me. You could argue that as well. So again, it's all about the key to the dream of Paro is understanding that 7 cows equals 7 years. That's the key. If you get that, everything else is totally rational. But that key information is extremely difficult to figure out unless you lived the Yosef lives before. You can figure out that the Rachel cows and there's 7 Leah cows, and the Leah cows are Rakos, they devoured the Yefas Toar. Then you make the connection with when else has the number 7 been significant in the lives of the Avos and in Chumash. The only example is 7 years for Rachel, 7 years for Leah, and that's with the Yaakov working for them. Now, okay. By the way, how many heavenly bodies are there? There are 13, right? Sun, moon, star, 13. So, 11 stars, 1 sun. In his dream, in Yosef's dream. Yeah, 13 heavenly bodies. So, 13 years later is exactly when the brothers come down and actually bow to him. Right? Because to the math, 7 years of... Is it true? Yeah. I'll give you an example. Yosef is 17 years old when he has the dreams. That's the Pasuk in Chumash. And he's 30, 13 years later, when they all bow down to him. So, it's pretty neat that the 13 celestial beings that are in the dream take place 13 years later after he has the dream. So, maybe it meant that the whole universe will bow down to me? I don't know, I'm not so sure. So, what I think we see here, I want to show one more thing, which is pretty neat. What did I put in this pasuk? I don't remember anymore. But what I think, what I wanted to show, I wanted to demonstrate was that if you really take a look at how do you understand dreams and messages in people's lives, I think there are significant hints in Chumash to understand how Yosef was able, with such confidence. And again, here's the problem. The problem is we don't see God speaking to Yosef, ever. Yet Yosef is 100% unequivocal in his interpretations of dreams. That's pretty bold, right? And he says it with such confidence every single time. Especially in front of Paro, man. You gotta have a lot of guts. Because if you say the wrong thing, the Midrash says, right, Yosef, that Paro has beheaded all of his Khartoumim who messed up. So there had to be something that appeared to Yosef as certain what the dream meant. And then, what is Yosef? And then Yosef then tells Paro, here, go back to the first page, at the bottom there, Lamed Beis. Va'al yishanos ha'chalom el Paro pamayim, twice, ki nachon hadavar mim Hashem u'maher Elokim lasoso. That it's nachon. This is correct. Right? This is going to happen. And it's going to happen sooner rather than later. And he says to him, you got to appoint someone who knows what they're doing. The king a key administrator, the governor of this. Kohen only. Right? I want to show you that. Yeah, Paro's like his father. He gives him a wife and changes his name, like a fatherly type of, like a fatherly type of figure. So I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, well, what's the message for our lives? How do we are supposed to interpret things that happen? On one hand, it could be dangerous. You have to be very careful. How do you give interpretation to your life? Should you ever be so certain and say, yes, this is what these things mean? You know, the Gemara tells us that in a dream, only 1/60th of a dream is true, whereas in the rest is sheker, the rest perhaps is garbage. Or just a psychological reflection about what happens to you in the day or your anxiety for the next day. I usually wake up like 5 minutes before my alarm, right? My biggest fear is I'm going to sleep in the morning, right? So I usually wake up 5 minutes before my alarm. And I think there are certain messages sometimes that we have in our own lives. I don't know if they're as clear as the Yosef narrative. I don't know if they're as clear as the Chanukah miracle. And next week we'll see that the Chanukah miracle is quite clear, but it might not be at all what you think is the real reason why we celebrate Chanukah. That'll be next week's topic. But what the connection between Chanukah and Yosef's story definitely is that without God ever saying anything to anybody directly, how are you supposed to know that God is sending you a message, that God is behind it? Right? That'll be the $1 million question next week for Chanukah. At the same time, how did Yosef know? So when you're able to really connect the dots, and that was the genius of Yosef, was that he had to key in. There's certain things that I'm hearing words that don't make any sense. They must be meaningful to me. Why am I in this position? Too many patterns, too many things are reoccurring. There must be some type of message. So if that's true, sometimes in life there are maybe direct messages that are said to us when they are crystal clear. When they are smack you in the face, then maybe you can give it interpretation and meaning. When they're not so obvious, which is 99% of the time, that requires a lot more thought, a lot more analysis, a lot more introspection in order to understand what we should be doing and what we should be interpreting and how we should be guiding our lives. But I think it's pretty neat how sometimes the Torah gives us a lot of clues to things which we think are miraculous. Really, 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 if you really think about it, they might be right there in Chumash themselves, giving us the key to understanding what's going on in the Torah and how God really did speak to Yosef. A little bit indirectly, but at the same time, God is speaking to Yosef during this time. Maybe that's what God speaks to the Jewish people in Galus, in the diaspora, in exile. not directly, but indirectly. We just have to be able to kind of figure out what the messages are in order to know what we're supposed to do in our lives. Obviously, much easier said than actually done. All right, Chanukah Sameach, Chanukah everybody.